Hi everyone. Next week is Pollinator Week. Did you know that? Well, now you know. Today I wanted to talk about what pollinators are, why they're declining, and what we can do to help them in our own backyards. So, what are pollinators exactly? A lot of people identify pollinators as bumblebees, but it extends beyond that. So, pollinators are any organism that move pollen from one flower to another. They carry pollen on either their fur on their bodies or just on their bodies. So, some examples of pollinators include bumblebees, but also butterflies, moths, birds, bats, and even some other small mammals. So, why are pollinators important? Why do we care about them? Well, by carrying pollen from one flower to the next, they're actually transferring genetic material from one flower to the next, which allows plants and flowers to reproduce or become pollinated. And so, yes, wind can do this, but pollinators specifically are a huge driver for pollination. So, obviously, pollinators are important to plants and pollination, but why are they important to us? Well, pollinators help to create a major component of our diet, which is crops. So, a stat from Klein et al. States that pollinators assist in pollinating over 180,000 different species of plants and over 1,200 crops. So, that means about approximately 1 out of 3 bites that you take are a result of pollinators. Unfortunately, there are many pollinator populations, especially bees, that are declining. And this decline is in response to habitat destruction, loss of food resources, chemical use in the environment, as well as changes in our climate and weather patterns. So, since pollinators provide such a vital service within our ecosystems, we want to try to help them out. But how can we do this? How can you do this at home? Well, one thing that you can do is create a pollinator garden in your own backyard or in your community. And this is essentially a garden with plant species that are very rich in nectar and pollen. So, nectar and pollen are a huge food resource for bumblebees and other pollinators. So, some examples of plants that you can incorporate into your garden that would help are rosemary, bergamot, which is also known as bee balm, buckwheat, chives, cosmos, cucumbers, and sunflowers. There are so many different types out there that you can incorporate into your garden, but that's just a few of them. When planting these flowers in your garden, try to plant them in clumps rather than having them scattered throughout your garden. Having them in clumps makes them easier for pollinators to find. When choosing plants to incorporate into your garden, try to choose plants that flower at different times so that food is always available to our pollinators. When it comes to choosing plants, bees specifically have color vision and they like the blues, violets, yellows, and whites better than other colors. So try to incorporate those colors. When it comes to butterflies, try to include dill, fennel, or milkweed. It's important for butterflies because their larvae feed on these plants. So if you've created your pollinator garden or you already have one, another thing you can do is be cautious. Learn how to spot bee nests within your backyard and be cautious not to disturb them in your activities. To spot bee nests within your backyard, here are some things to look for. So many species prefer dark and dry areas, and different species nest in different locations. So there's some that are underground, there are some that are ground dwelling, and then there are some that are above ground. So for those underground species, they like abandoned mouse holes. For those ground dwelling species, they like compost piles or grass piles within your yard, and above ground species really like abandoned bird houses. So another way that you can support pollinators, and bumblebees in particular, is to create a bumblebee nest of your own. So you can have it in your backyard or in your community. And so to do that, check out the link below from Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and I'll show you how to do it. And lastly, another thing you can do is support your local farmers and beekeepers by purchasing local organic foods and honey. So like I said earlier, next week is Pollinator Week. So now that you know a little bit more about pollinators and how you can help them, I hope that you actually take the actions to help them out sometime next week and beyond next week, but especially next week. Have a great weekend and enjoy the sunshine.